In grade 6, we began with a candy cane or diagonal pattern. This pattern was more difficult than those introduced in the primary grades because the core is not explicit. We call this a two-color candy cane because it uses two colors, and a two-bead candy cane because each of the diagonal stripes is 2 beads wide. What columns make up the core for this two-color, two-bead candy cane? Did you focus on the visual pattern, the numeric pattern, or both? What other patterns do you see? Christina taught the students that she uses a numbering system to keep track of the beads she'll need for each column. Below each column, she records the number of beads of each color she'll need in the order that they'll be picked up on the needle. For example, for column 1, she'll need 1 blue bead, then 2 red beads, then 2 blue beads, then 2 red beads. Christina filled the template up to the 10th column, and the students were asked to copy and extend the pattern to the 20th column. They were then asked to identify the section of the pattern that repeats, the pattern core. The students identified the first 4 columns as the unit of repeat and had various ways of justifying their thinking. Some students looked at the numeric pattern and identified that the number pattern for the first 2 columns repeated in columns 3 and 4, but that the colors were different, and so the pattern was made up of columns 1 to 4. Other students looked at the visual pattern of the first 4 columns and predicted that this 4-column structure, when rotated 180 degrees, would be congruent. The first 4 columns represented the fewest number of columns for which this was true, and so were identified as the core. For example, the same is true if you rotate a core made up of columns 1 to 8, but this can be broken down into 2 groups of 4 columns. Students tested their theory by copying the 4-column structure on the interactive whiteboard and rotating the core. Still other students used occluders, or strips of paper, to isolate different parts of the pattern to determine the unit of repeat, and through visual trial and error identified the first 4 columns as the core of the pattern. Christina then introduced students to the chevron pattern. Here is an example of a 2-color, 2-bead chevron. What columns make up the core for this pattern? Again, did you focus on the visual pattern, the numeric pattern, or both? This pattern emphasizes the need to have an odd number of rows so that there is a middle row that acts as a horizontal line of symmetry. Again, the students found that having both the visual and numeric representation of the pattern helped them to find the core. As with the diagonal pattern, the students recognized that the first 2 columns of numbers are repeated in the second 2 columns, but the colors of the numbers change. Therefore, the core is made up of the first 4 columns. Others identified the visual pattern of the first 4 columns and described the central yellow chevron surrounded by parts of red chevrons on either side. Students then analyzed a 3-color, 3-bead chevron to determine how many columns were in the core. What columns make up the core for this pattern? Again, the students had a variety of ways to do this. They identified the core by finding the columns that were the same, either visually or numerically. Students found that column 10 was identical to column 1, and so reasoned that the core comprised columns 1 to 9. Students described imagining superimposing the first 9 columns onto the next 9 columns to see if they matched. They then used the interactive whiteboard to copy the core and overlay it onto columns 10 to 18. This video is part of a longer video we made for the students so that they could further reflect on their initial pattern design experiences.